They had been chasing Kael Morrow for 11 months before the race. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. Not the officials. Not the sports commentators who would spend 3 weeks dissecting the finish line footage frame by frozen frame. Not the physiologists who filed a 40-page report concluding, in the careful language of people who do not want to be laughed at, that the data was anomalous. Nobody talked about the watching. Nobody mentioned the pale figures stationed in the upper decks of every stadium where Kael had competed in the last year, dressed in the colors of whatever crowd surrounded them. Faces like smoothed clay, eyes that did not blink at the right intervals. The Veth had been managing humanity for 230 years by then. That was their word for it, managing, in the language they used with each other. A language built not from sound but from bioluminescent pulse patterns that rippled along their dermal membranes. The word translated more precisely as, tending a crop that does not know it is being tended. They were patient farmers. They had reshaped the surface of the earth into a controlled environment, introduced artificial weather systems that maximized human productivity and minimized human unrest, seeded human culture with enough genuine beauty and enough manufactured conflict to keep the species occupied. They were very good at what they did. To Fuke. They had been doing it for longer than any living human's great-grandmother could remember. The arrangement was not violent. That was what the Veth's handler class operatives, the ones disses who wore human shapes and walked among the population, always noted in their assessment files. No violence necessary. The humans were not imprisoned. They were simply directed. Their infrastructure ran on systems the Veth maintained. Their medicine was dispensed through channels the Veth monitored. Their communication networks carried everything they sent to each other. And the Veth read every word. The humans did not know. They had their theories, fringe voices, paranoid blogs, the occasional documentary that circulated briefly before being quietly de-indexed. But they did not know, and not knowing made the management smooth, frictionless, durable. What made it work was control of the signal. That was how the handlers described the human nervous system internally. A signal, complex, recursive, beautiful in its way, but ultimately a signal like any other, with an amplitude that could be modulated, a frequency that could be shifted, a carrier wave that could be interrupted. The Veth had mapped the entire architecture of human neurological experience within 40 years of their arrival. Every emotion had a measurable substrate. Every act of creativity, every flash of intuition, every dream, all of it ran on hardware they understood completely, except for what happened occasionally when a human pushed too hard. The file on Kael Morrow was thick. 6 years old, Kenyan-American, raised in Eldoret and then Chicago. Mother, a schoolteacher, deceased. Father, a retired long-distance runner who had coached Kael from the age of 7 on the red clay roads outside the city before his knees gave out. The father's influence was documented carefully. He had given Kael something that the handlers found difficult to quantify. A relationship with pain that was not adversarial. Most humans, when they encountered the body's limit signals, the burning, the tearing, the white-hot insistence of oxygen debt, treated them as walls. Kael had been taught to treat them as weather. Something you ran through. His first world record had come at the World Championships in Vienna, 18 months ago. The 400 meters. A time so far outside the predicted performance envelope that the testing officials had kept him in a lab for 6 hours afterward, convinced of pharmaceutical involvement. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. What Kael had done in Vienna was not chemical. It was something older and stranger than chemistry. The handlers had flagged his signal for unusual variance after Vienna. The specific pattern they were watching for was rare, but not unprecedented. Approximately 1 in 900 million humans, across the entire history of the species, had shown it, a kind of resonance instability. When the body was driven past a certain threshold, the signal would occasionally slip its bandwidth for a fraction of a second. The human would experience it as a moment of impossible clarity. Colors too vivid, sounds arriving a half-beat before their sources, a sense of vast cold space behind the familiar world. Most of them dismissed it as an adrenaline hallucination. A handful had not. Those were the cases the Veth watched, with the particular stillness of an apex predator who has spotted movement in tall grass. The race at the Continental Invitational in Nairobi was supposed to be controlled. That was the term the senior handler used in the briefing the night before. Controlled. 4 operatives embedded in the stadium, 2 in the adjacent runner cohort. Signal modulation equipment running passive dampening on a half-kilometer radius around the track. Kael's variant spikes, suppress it, keep him in range. Let him run his race, break his record if he wants to. The spectacle was good for the population's mood index. And then bring him home clean. It was the kind of plan that worked every time. And had worked every time. For 230 years. Kael's coach, a broad-shouldered woman named Fatima, who had known him since the Vienna Championships, was waiting for him at the warm-up track at 5:30 in the morning. The sun wasn't up yet. The stadium lights were on. Tall white towers flooding the track in a light that looked clinical, purposeful, the color of a question being asked. Tima was holding a thermos of tea that had gone cold while she waited, and she did not offer it to him because she could tell, from the way he was walking, that he didn't need it. Sleep, she asked. Some, he said. She looked at him the way she'd learned to look at him over 4 years. Scanning without staring, reading the body instead of the face, the way he held his shoulders, the small tension around his jaw. That meant he was listening to something she couldn't hear. Your legs are going to give you trouble in the back stretch, she said. Left hamstring. You know this. I know, he said. I want you to run controlled. Want you, in second at the 200 mark. Feeling good. And I want you to find your gear at the 300. Clean. Understood? He looked at the track. The red surface was still wet from the overnight maintenance rinse, and it caught the floodlights in a way that made it look like it was faintly alive. Like the track itself was breathing. He had the thought. The way he sometimes had thoughts in the early morning, quiet before a race. That the surface beneath his feet was never entirely what it appeared. That the solidity of things was a performance. He didn't know where thoughts like that came from. He'd had them since he was a child, running on the red roads outside Eldoret with his father's voice behind him. Keep moving, Kael. Never stop moving. The moment you stop is when it catches you. He'd never asked what it was. He hadn't needed to. Controlled, he said, yeah. Fatima watched him finish his warm-up stretches and head inside. She drank her cold tea and looked at the sky, which was doing something interesting at the horizon. A thin line of green light below the blue-black, there and gone. The way things sometimes were at the edge of vision. The stadium filled by 8 o'clock. 60,000 people. The noise of them, hours before the race, was a physical thing. A pressure in the air, a warm mass of wanting. The 400 meters was the showcase event. Scheduled for 11, Kael would run in the final heat, alone against the clock by his own request, the way he always raced now. He'd stopped caring about the other competitors or somewhere around Vienna. He wasn't running against people. Against a feeling he was always almost reaching. In the upper deck, in a section cordoned off with the bright yellow tape of a technical fault. Seats unavailable. 4 figures sat in a row and watched the warm-ups below. They looked like middle-aged men in Sports Authority vests. They had the right badges, the right lanyards, the right faces. Forgettable faces. Faces that the human eye slid away from without consciously registering. The face shaping was one of the first things the Veth had developed after their arrival. A biomorphic projection system embedded in a membrane that read the expectations of nearby observers and generated a visual surface that matched those expectations perfectly. You saw what you were looking for. You saw what was safe. The lead handler, internally designated Overseer 7, though the designation was as arbitrary as all Veth administrative labels, was monitoring the passive dampening field on a device that resembled a tablet computer. The field was running clean. Kael's signal was within acceptable parameters. Everything was in order. The father is in the stadium, one of the other handlers noted. Noted, said Overseer 7. The journalist from the Vienna piece is here also. 3rd row, east stand. She's not a concern. She's been interviewing people who knew his mother before the accident. A pause. The Veth communicated more efficiently in their pulse language, but in public, among humans, they used the spoken tongue, and the pause that passed between Overseer 7 and the second handler carried something that human observers, had there been any, might have read as unease. There was a reason the mother's file had a restricted access code. "She's not a concern," Overseer 7 repeated. The runners were called to the track at 10:55. Kael came through the tunnel last, the way he always did. He walked slowly and the crowd noise swelled when they recognized him. 60,000 voices becoming one continuous roar that was less a sound than a change in the composition of the air. He had the tunnel to himself for those last 30 meters, and the noise built ahead of him like something he was walking toward rather than into. He had his father's old training shirt on under the competition kit, the one that said Eldoret, in letters that had faded from red to a pale rust pink. He wore it for every race. He'd worn it the day his mother died, and the day his father's coaching license had been revoked by the National Federation without explanation, for reasons that were never adequately explained. A bureaucratic error, they'd said, paperwork, nothing personal. His father had never coached him officially again after that. But he'd called every week without fail, and the calls always ended the same way. "Keep moving, Kael." He took his position at the start. The stadium was loud, and then it was quiet in the way that stadiums become quiet in the last seconds before a race. Not silence, exactly, but a held breath. 60,000 people breathing in together and holding it. He looked down at the track surface, the red and the white lane lines, the way the material gave slightly under his spikes. A familiar giving, the track meeting him back. He thought of something his mother had told him. Once when he was 7 years old, and had asked her why the sky was so high, she'd said, "Because something had to be. Because the world needs a ceiling, Kael. And then it needs someone who wants to find out what's above it." He'd thought about that his whole life. He still didn't know if it was wisdom, or a thing she'd said to fill the silence on a car ride somewhere. He didn't know if it mattered. The starter raised the gun. The gun fired. He ran. The first 100 meters were smooth. The way the start of a hard race was always smooth, the body not yet having caught up to what was being asked of it. The joints still carrying the morning's ease. He felt himself find the lane, the shoulders dropping into competition posture, the heel-ball-toe cycle of the sprint settling into its groove. He was moving well. The crowd noise was a shape he moved inside of, familiar as weather. At the 150 mark, the left hamstring spoke. Not loudly, a whisper. The same whisper Fatima had predicted, the body keeping its promises. "Here I am. Here is my limit. Here is the wall you and I have discussed before." He'd run through that whisper in Vienna, and at the indoor championships in Stuttgart, and at every hard session on the practice track for the last 6 months. He knew its texture. He ran through it the same way he always ran through it. Not by ignoring it, but by accepting it completely and choosing to continue anyway. His mother's voice, somewhere behind the hamstrings, whisper, "Because the world needs a ceiling, Kael, and then it needs someone." At the 200 mark he was in position, as Fatima had prescribed. Moving well, not burning, the reserve still there. He registered the lap time from the board at the corner, but didn't think about it. Numbers were for after. During was something else. That was when the dampening field failed. It failed for a reason the handler's equipment would log but never fully explain. A cascade interaction between the signalulation array and a solar weather event that the VETH's atmospheric monitoring had rated as low probability and therefore low priority, the kind of small miscalculation that compounds. One of the 4 dampeners in the upper deck hiccuped. A gap opened in the field, not large, not for long. 400 milliseconds, maybe 500. Long enough. At 212 meters into his race, Kael Morrow's signal slipped. It happened the way it had happened at Vienna, and once before that, in a practice run outside Chicago in the rain, when he'd pushed so deep into the oxygen debt that the world had briefly taken on that unbearable clarity. The colors arriving before themselves, the sounds ringing at a frequency below the audible, the sense of cold and vast space just behind everything. This time, it was stronger than it had ever been. This time the gap in the field, wide enough the threats unrolled, it's deep enough that what happened wasn't a flicker. It was a door. He didn't stop running. Was there? The thing that the VETH monitoring his vitals would later call the most extraordinary component of the event. He was in 2 places at once. His body still in the track in Nairobi, moving at a pace that was already outside the projected performance envelope. His legs, eating the distance with a cadence that the finish line cameras would record at a frequency human officials initially assumed was a technical error, and somewhere else, somewhere cold and very large, with a ceiling of machinery he couldn't make sense of, and his own body below him, and the sense of something enormous all around, something patient and present, something that had been there the whole time. He saw it the way you see a room when a light flicks on for half a second in the dark, not enough to map it, enough to know it's there, enough to know the room is much bigger than the one you were told you were standing in. He screamed, not with his voice. His voice was still in Nairobi, still making the sounds a runner makes at 300 meters into a hard 400, the forced exhale, the rhythm. But somewhere else, some other part of him that had never been given a word, it screamed. It screamed the way things scream when they discover the ground is farther down than they expected. In the upper deck, Overseer 7 was on his feet. "Press," he said, which was not a word but a burst of bioluminescent urgency that his vocal synthesizer rendered as a single flat syllable. "Field is not. Suppress it." Now, the three other handlers moved. Whatever they did was not visible to any of the 60,000 people in that stadium, because what they did was not physical. It was a targeted signal intervention, a concentrated push aimed at a single point in a single nervous system, the Veth equivalent of grabbing someone by the collar and pulling hard. It was designed to be overwhelming. It had worked every single time, in 230 years of recorded use. Kael Morrow's left hamstring tore completely at 340 meters. The sound was described by two runners in adjacent lanes as a sound like a thick rope snapping. The physios at the finish line heard it from 20 meters away. Kael's stride collapsed on the left side, the body reorganizing itself around the damage with the desperate grammar of survival. The right leg taking more, the core overcompensating, the arms swinging wider to maintain the balance that the left leg had abandoned. He kept running. The handler's suppression signal was in him. He could feel it. Not as pain, the pain was everywhere, and uniform, and had stopped meaning anything distinct, but as a kind of gravity. A pulling down. A voice that was not a voice. "Stop, stop, stop. This is not possible. You cannot do this. Stop." A very old voice, patient and certain, a voice that had been speaking to his species for as long as anyone alive could remember. And somewhere behind it, buried under 230 years of silence, his father's voice. "Keep moving, Kael. The moment you stop is when it catches you." He did not know what he was running from. He did not know what he was running toward. He knew the track under his spikes, and the air in his lungs, and the pain that was so total it became a landscape he moved through, rather than a sensation he experienced. He knew the last 60 meters were in front of him. He knew his mother had told him there was something above the ceiling. He knew he had felt it. Back there at the 300 mark, the cold and the vast and the machinery and the truth. And he knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with thinking that if he stopped, he would never feel it again. They would see to that. Something had been watching him for a long time, and it would see to that. He ran. At 370 meters, the second suppression burst hit him. Overseer 7 had abandoned subtlety. This was a full-power intervention, the kind used in the very rare cases, fewer than 20 documented in the entire history of Veth management. When a human signal variance threatened to become a public event, the burst was designed to drop a human being in their tracks, to produce a complete motor shutdown, to return the nervous system to a compliant null state from which it could be gently guided back to baseline. Kael staggered. One step, two. The left leg nearly buckled entirely, and the crowd noise changed, the roar becoming something with a different frequency inside it, fear mixing with the wanting. 60,000 people, recognizing that something was wrong with the man they were watching, that the thing they were seeing was not a sporting performance, but something rawer and harder and more frightening. His stride found itself again. Not the clean stride of a healthy runner. Freeze. Not the practiced, optimized movement that years of coaching had built. Something else. A broken, limping, forward-lunging movement that had no name in any athletics manual because it had never been seen before. The body improvising its own locomotion, with whatever tissue was still intact. The will producing a form of motion that the form had no right to produce. He was 6 feet tall, and the suppression signal was pressing him toward the ground, and his left leg was a ruin, and he was moving forward. The handlers in the upper deck were very still. Overseer 7 ran a calculation he had never needed to run before. If the human reached the finish line in this state, in front of 60,000 witnesses, in front of cameras transmitting to a global audience, if the signals he was now broadcasting, the resonance variance that was spiking so far outside the containment envelope, that the monitoring equipment had simply stopped logging it and gone to a flat alert line. If all of that became a recorded public event, the question of what to do with it became significantly more complicated. Intervention, he said. Physical. We're exposed, said the second handler. Too many witnesses. It doesn't matter. Stop him. The 2 handlers assigned to the runner cohort moved. They were fast in ways that human bodies shouldn't be fast. The vethmorphic shell could produce outputs that the human form was not designed for in short bursts when the situation required it. They closed the distance from their positions on the track infield with a speed that would look, on the camera footage later, like the footage had skipped. A jump cut, a compression artifact, nothing that suggested intention. Kael saw them coming. He didn't know what they were. He didn't have words for what he was seeing. The way their faces seemed to slip slightly as they moved fast, the smooth clay quality of their expressions, the eyes that caught the stadium lights at an angle, that eyes shouldn't catch light. He didn't know. He just knew that the thing he'd felt at the 300 mark, the cold room and the vast machinery, was connected to them. He knew it the way you know things in the deep end of a hard run, past the place where the rational mind operates, in the animal layer that is older than language. He had 10 meters to the line. The nearest handler reached for him. What happened next? Took 0.8 seconds by the timing equipment, and was watched by 60,000 people and a global broadcast audience of approximately 400 million, and was then watched by those 400 million people many more times after the fact, in slow motion, at various speeds, and was discussed and dissected for years, with conclusions ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary, and the only consensus that emerged from all that watching was that nobody had a clean explanation for it. Kael Morrow moved through the reach. He moved the way something moves when it has decided that stopping is not a category of thing available to it. The handler's hand passed through the space where Kael's arm was and found nothing. Not because Kael had dodged. There was no dodging. The leg was destroyed. There was no athleticism left. But because the commitment to forward motion was so total, so structurally complete, that the handler's ability to arrest that motion was simply not sufficient. Trying to hold a river with your hand. The water doesn't fight you. It just goes around. Kael Morrow crossed the finish line. He crossed it on one leg, and the momentum of the crossing carried him forward, and he went down on the track the way things fall, when the will that has been holding them up finally relinquishes, not a collapsed but a laying down, a placing of himself on the red surface, arms out, chest flat, the left side of his face pressed against the track, and his breath coming in sounds that no crowd noise could cover. The clock said 8.91 seconds, a new world record. The stadium was making a sound that had no category. Overseer 7 stood in the upper deck and watched the medics run toward Kael, and watched the second handler melt back into the crowd with the smooth efficiency of long practice. And he ran his assessments, and the assessments all said the same thing. Contained. The signal is down. The variance is returning to baseline. The subject is incapacitated. The word felt less certain than it usually did. He would file the report as an anomalous exceedance event. He would recommend enhanced monitoring. He would recommend the standard memory adjustment protocol once the subject was in medical care. A gentle thing carefully applied, it would leave the race intact, leave the record intact, leave everything visible and intact, and excise only the moments of variance, the 300 mark and the cold room and the machinery, and whatever had been in Kael's signal in those last 10 meters that had made the handler's reach insufficient. It was a clean solution. It had always been a clean solution. He looked at the track below, where the medics were surrounding Kael, and the crowd was still making that sound, and something moved across Overseer 7's smooth face that had no name in Veth administrative language. The face shaping responded to it by pulling the expression toward the baseline neutral, which was what it always did, because the handlers' faces were not built for what they felt. The face was a management tool, not an organ. He looked away. In the medic tent, 3 days later, Kael was sitting in a hospital chair with both legs in bracing that would come off eventually. Maybe, the physio said. We'll see how the tissue responds. He had a window that looked out on a parking lot, and beyond the parking lot a stretch of road, and beyond the road a hill with grass on it, brown grass in the dry season. He stared at the hill sometimes. He had the feeling he was supposed to be doing something, working something out, a thought that was right at the edge and wouldn't arrive. The feeling was familiar the way something is familiar when you've dreamed it often enough. His father was there, had been there since the second day. He sat in the other chair and watched the football on the small television with the sound turned down low, and occasionally said things that didn't need responses. The kind of things fathers say when they're really just making the noise of being present, which is the most important noise. The journalist came on the third afternoon. She was maybe 35, serious face, notebook, the kind of person who introduced herself by name and waited to see if you'd remember it. Amara. She asked if she could ask him a few questions about the race, and Kael said, sure, and his father turned the television down further. She asked about the hamstring, which was the obvious question, and about training, and about Vienna, which she'd covered and which she asked about with a specificity that suggested she'd reviewed everything written about it. She was circling something. Kael could tell, the same way he could sometimes tell, at the deep end of a run when something was in the room. Then she asked, in the last 50 meters, the footage shows 2 individuals on the infield who seem to move faster than they should. Security staff, the Federation says, but their credentials don't correspond to any registered officials at the event. Been trying to find for 3 days. Kael's father turned the television off. Kael looked at the journalist. He looked at his hands. He had a slow walnut in his left hand, from the fruit bowl the nurses left, and he was turning it over the same way he'd turned things over since he was a child. The meditative rolling, something about the solidity of it. He looked at the walnut. I don't remember much, he said, after the hamstring went, which was true. The edges of the race were blurry in a way that the physio said was normal. Dissociation under extreme pain, the brain protecting itself. The specific quality of the blur was strange. It had a flat gray texture, an erasure quality, like a section of audio that had been muted rather than naturally faded. He didn't have language for that. You remember nothing, Amara said. I remember the start, the first 200, to the hamstring. He paused. I remember a feeling. What kind of feeling? He turned the walnut over in his hand. The smooth and the rough. The shell that was harder than it looked. Like something behind the wall, he said. Like the race wasn't the point of the race. Amara wrote something. She didn't ask him to clarify. Your mother, she said. She worked at a biochemistry research facility in Nairobi. Before she died, she was a teacher, Kael said. She was. For that. 6 years before. Until she resigned, she worked at the Nairobi Bioscience Institute. Amara opened her notebook. The institute ran a project. The archive record calls it a study of anomalous neurological signaling in high-performance athletic subjects. Most of the project documentation was destroyed in a server failure in 2019. I found a summary. It describes a specific neurological signature, a resonance pattern, they called it. It appears during extreme physical exertion in certain individuals. It's described as an indicator of what the project researchers called substrate variance. She paused. Your mother was one of the researchers. Kael was very still. I don't know what that means, he said. I don't entirely know what it means either, Amara said. But I know that 2 of the other researchers on that project died within 2 years of the project being shut down. One in a car accident, one in a fall at home. And I know that your mother died in what was listed as a drowning accident, which is strange, because I talked to 3 people who knew her, and they all said she was afraid of water. Never went near it voluntarily. The walnut was very still in Kael's hand. His father was looking at the floor. She never talked to me about her research, Kael said. She talked to me about running. I know, Amara said. I found some of her notes. Not from the project, personal notes. You're in them. She wrote about your running as early as age 4. She wrote. Amara checked the notebook, reading carefully. She wrote that you moved as if you already knew the shape of where you were going. She wrote that she was afraid for you and proud of you, and that she was working on something that might matter for people like you. She wrote that she hoped she'd finish it in time. Amara looked up. Project was shut down 8 months after she wrote that. Kael looked at the walnut, the smooth and the rough. He turned it over once, twice, a third time. He was looking at it the way he sometimes looked at the track before a race, reading it, asking it something, waiting for the answer that wasn't a word. She told me the sky was high because the world needs a ceiling, he said. She said, it needs a ceiling and then it needs someone who wants to find out what's above it. Amara did not write anything. She was very quiet. I felt something, Kael said, in the race. At the 250 mark. I felt it at Vienna too for a second. But this was longer. It was like a door. A door that was open for a second and then they shut it. He stopped. I don't know who they is. I don't remember what was on the other side. But I remember the cold. And I remember feeling like I'd been running toward that door my whole life, without knowing the door was what I was running toward. His father made a sound that wasn't a word. She knew, his father said, quietly to the floor. She knew and she was trying to. He didn't finish the sentence. Put his face in his hands and Kael looked at him, and then looked away. The way you look away to give someone their privacy even when there's nowhere else to look. Amara closed her notebook. I'm going to publish what I have, she said. I don't know if it'll matter. I don't know if anyone will believe it. I have a friend who worked in signal processing, defense sector, who's been running some analysis on the electromagnetic environment in the stadium during your race. She paused. He found a pattern he's never seen before. High directional, concentrated, specifically located. He called it a suppression event. He said it looked like someone trying to stop a signal. Are you in danger? Kael asked. Publishing this. Amara looked at him with an expression that was tired and certain at once. Probably, she said, but I knew your mother. She stood. She said she'd be in contact. She left. Kael sat with his father in the quiet room with the window looking out at the brown hill and the walnut in his hand and the flat gray blur where some part of the race used to be and the edge of vision feeling of something he was supposed to be working out. His father looked up eventually. His eyes were the same eyes Kael had been running toward and away from and toward again his whole life. And in them was something that his father had never said out loud. A knowledge, a weight, a long vigil over a thing that had needed protecting. She wanted you to be ready, his father said, when the time came. Ready for what? His father looked at the window, at the hill, at the dry season brown of the grass and the blue of the sky above it. Find out what's above the ceiling, he said. Kael looked at his legs and their bracing. The physio had said 6 months to walk. 2 years before any serious consideration of return to athletic activity. The numbers were authoritative. The medical literature was clear. He turned the walnut over in his hand. He felt the smoothness and the rough. He thought about 10 meters. He thought about a handler's reach, passing through the space where his arm was, and finding nothing. He thought about the door at the 250 mark, the cold and the vast, the machinery of something enormous and patient that had been there the whole time. And what it meant that it needed to be hidden this badly, and what it meant that one man on a ruined leg had made it through the last 10 meters anyway, and what it meant that his mother had spent 6 years trying to understand people like him, and what it meant that someone had needed to shut that down. He thought about the word the journalist had used. Substrate. He didn't know what it meant exactly, but he thought it meant the thing underneath, the floor of the floor, the wall behind the wall. The ceiling above the ceiling that someone built the ceiling to hide. He opened his hand. The walnut sat in his palm. He looked at it for a long time. Then, very slowly, he closed his fingers around it and he squeezed. The walnut cracked. Not the casual cracking of ordinary pressure. It cracked with a sharp final report, like a shot, like something that had been decided. 2 halves fell apart in his palm, clean all the way through. His left hand hurt. His left leg was a ruin. His record stood at 8.91 seconds in a stadium in Nairobi, with a dampening field and 2 inhuman shapes closing from the infield and 60,000 people watching something they didn't have language for. He looked at the two halves of the walnut. He looked at the window. He looked at the hill. Outside, in the corridor behind a door that bore the nameplate of a hospital administrator, who had never been assigned to this wing, a figure stood very still and watched the monitoring feed and filed a report. Mr. Morrow is an interesting case. The report said, which was what these reports always said. But not a threat. The memory adjustment protocol had been applied with standard precision. He will not race again. He will not walk again, for that matter. We anticipate no further incidents. At the end of the report, in a field marked for additional observations, Overseer 7 added a line he had never added to a report before, in all 230 years of his assignment. The subject continues to demonstrate inexplicable signal coherence. I recommend reclassification of this case from resolve to monitoring indefinite. He sent the report. He stood in the hallway outside the room. He stood there for a long time, very still, in the way his kind was very still. Not resting but waiting. Patient farmer, always patient. And, through the door, he could hear the sound of a father and a son not speaking. The specific silence of two people holding something between them that doesn't need to be said. Somewhere underneath it, barely audible, the sound of walnut shells on a linoleum floor. He turned and walked away. Behind him, through the door, Kael Morrow said something to his father in a low voice. Overseer 7's audio resolution was exceptional at this range. He heard every word. Kael said was, "I'm going to need to start training Overseer 7's. Walk to the end of the corridor." He turned the corner. He did not look back. He filed the case as resolved. He knew it wasn't.